Hello, once again. In a recent sermon about marriage, I discussed the need for adjustment. When two people marry, each one has been shaped by a range of influences and experiences, and they bring those into the marriage. And those influences include factors like moral and religious upbringing, friendship, genetics, parental example, relationship with mother, relationship with father, cultural influences, education, and so forth. And those influences will be different for each spouse. And so there's going to be a need for adjustment if a husband and wife can learn to live together compatibly. Take my wife Lavinia and myself when we married. Now, the most obvious difference, and this applies to every heterosexual couple, is that one is male and the other is female. Lavinia had been born and raised in Australia. I had spent the first half of my life growing up in England. Lavinia grew up in Adelaide in South Australia. The first 7.5 years of my time in Australia were spent in Sydney. Lavinia lived in the same house from when she was born until the day that she married me. On the other hand, when I got married, I'd lived in 15 different addresses in 2 different countries, and I'd spent the previous 4 years living on my own. Lavinia's parents had remained married right throughout their lives, whereas my parents had, you might say, a difficult marriage, which eventually led to divorce. So when Lavinia and I married, as I've said, there were very different backgrounds. So what I want us to consider today is how we deal with those differences. And we're going to look at 3 cases in the Bible and then draw some practical applications. But first, I want us to go back to Genesis, the 17th chapter, and we're going to begin there in verse 9, because there's a matter here which is crucial in 2 of the cases that we're going to look at. Way back in the time of Abraham, God introduced male circumcision as a religious necessity amongst his people, the Israelites. Genesis chapter 17, beginning in verse 9, God said to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised. Every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring, both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant." This was indeed a very serious matter. In fact, we note in verse 14, "Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." In other words, any Israelite male in whom this act was not carried out was no longer a part of God's covenant people. He was banished from among them. So that is, as I say, a vital aspect, serving as background. So we now go ahead about 620 years down to the time of Moses, and we go over to Exodus, the 4th chapter, and verse 24. Moses was born and raised in the land of Egypt. He spent his first 40 years there. Then he headed east to the land of Midian, where he spent a further 40 years. And there it was that he married a lady named Zipporah. And at various stages, he had 2 sons, the first of them being Gershom. Then, when Moses was 80 years old, God appeared to him, telling him to go back to Egypt and to lead God's people, the Israelites, out of Egyptian slavery. Moses at first was very reluctant and used various excuses, but God in the end persuaded him. And so Moses, with his wife Zipporah and their son Gershom, headed west back to Egypt. And this leads to a rather strange event, which is described in Exodus chapter 4, beginning in verse 24. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it. Some versions say threw it at his feet and said, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." So he let him alone. God let Moses alone. It was then that she said, Zipporah, a bridegroom of blood, because of the circumcision. As I say, a rather strange event. God has just chosen Moses and indeed persuaded Moses to go back to Egypt to take leadership of the Israelites. And now we're told that God sought to put him to death. If God really wanted to put him to death, God could have done so instantly and nothing could have been done about it. As it was, there was time here to react and time here to know what the issue was. So God here is indicating there's something very important which needs to be dealt with. And Zipporah realized it was the matter of circumcision. So she circumcises her son. But she's obviously very angry about it. Why hadn't Moses done this earlier? Because after all, he was an Israelite. He was aware of God's requirements, yet he had not carried out this most important of requirements in regard to his son. The anger of Zipporah may well be the clue. She, remember, was of a different culture, a different religious background. And it may well have been that she was utterly opposed to this, and Moses went along with it until such time as God forced the issue. Remember, this was a covenant issue. And so eventually, Zipporah very angrily deals with the matter. So you can say here, in this matter of difference, the wife adjusted to her husband's background. We next go ahead about 470 years over to 1 Kings chapter 11. And this brings us to the time of King Solomon and the Israelite monarchy. And I'm going to read here, beginning in 1 Kings 11 and verse 1. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, "You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you. For surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. You might ask, what's a concubine? Well, if I use the definition from the Zondervan Pictorial Bible Dictionary, quote, a concubine is a woman lawfully united in marriage to a man in a relation inferior to that of the regular wife, unquote. So this was something that was a part of polygamy, where you might have had a chief wife, a senior wife, something like that, and then wives of lesser rank. That was a concubine. Why Solomon, with all of his wisdom, married 700 wives and 300 concubines, I cannot explain. Although there may be something of a clue back in 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 1. We're told there that Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, a marriage alliance. If you go back to the Middle Ages and thereafter in Europe, you will find that there were often alliances between royal families in different countries that were tied by means of marriage. You go back to the start of the 20th century, many royal families throughout Europe in different countries were tied by marriage to Queen Victoria of England. So perhaps with Solomon, many marriages may have been the result of political alliances. But nevertheless, he married 700 wives and 300 concubines. So let me just start again with verse 3. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. And so he did for all his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrificed to their gods. Here we have Solomon, an Israelite who was a follower of Yahweh, marrying wives and concubines who were from pagan backgrounds, who had their own pagan gods in the form of idols. Now, God had been very specific way back when Israel had, even before Israel entered Canaan, God had made it clear to them that they were not to marry the pagan people. Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 3, you shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. And then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you. And so it goes on. Solomon ignored that. Here you have wives from one background, Solomon from another background. Now, in the case of Zipporah and Moses, we find that the wife adjusted to her husband's background. Now, in the case of Moses and his wives and concubines, Moses adapts to their background and thus no longer being fully committed to God, but engaging in idol worship. Then we've got a third example, and for this we jump ahead roughly 980 years down to Acts the 16th chapter, and beginning there in verse 1. Jesus Christ has come, carried out his earthly ministry. He's been crucified and resurrected and ascended back to heaven. Christianity with the church has been established. The apostles have gone out preaching the gospel. Saul of Tarsus has been converted, and as Paul begins to carry out missionary work in various places, in Acts chapter 16, he comes to his second missionary journey. And we read there in verse 1 that Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. Those are towns in what is now called Turkey, and Paul had also been there on his previous missionary journey. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. So you have Timothy, who is the son of a Jewish woman, and we'll find out in a moment when we go over to 2 Timothy that her name was Eunice. And they had eventually become Christians, quite possibly on Paul's previous missionary journey. However, it says here that Timothy's father was Greek, so non-Jewish, from a pagan background. So Timothy was the result of a mixed marriage, if you like. Then we go down to verse 3. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. So we come back once again to that Old Testament practice of circumcision for religious reasons. Now, when Christianity was established, there was no longer any religious requirement for circumcision. In fact, as we saw in an earlier sermon, anybody who tried to bind that upon Christians was doing the wrong thing. But from purely physical point of view, it had no significance whatsoever. So because there were Jewish people who were opposed to Christianity, who were aware of Timothy's background, Paul had Timothy circumcised purely as an expedient to avoid unnecessary argument and confrontation. But this is telling us something. Remember, Timothy's father was from a non-Jewish pagan background. His mother was of a Jewish background. And as we saw in Genesis chapter 17, male circumcision was a very important part of things for the Jew. Now, yes, Timothy and his mother had eventually become Christians, but prior to that, Timothy's mother would have been following the Old Testament law with all of its practices. But for some reason, and that's probably to do with his father, Timothy had not been circumcised. And that would have been probably something of concern, to say the least, to Timothy's mother. So in that case, Timothy's mother had adapted to the wishes, the background of her husband, Timothy's father. However, we go over to 2 Timothy chapter 1, where Paul is writing to Timothy, talking to him about various things. We read this in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5. Paul says, I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you as well. So there's an indication here of Timothy's mother and grandmother, both being of a Jewish background, having a faith in God. But then we jump over the page to 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 14. Paul here says to Timothy, but as for you, continue in what you have learned and have firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it. And whom there in the Greek is in the plural. So more than one person had taught Timothy, and that was probably his mother and his grandmother. Verse 15, and how from childhood you have been acquainted with the sacred writings which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. Timothy's mother, as I said, was of a Jewish background, so the scriptures that he would have been taught from childhood would have been the Old Testament scriptures. That's significant. The indication is that because of the pagan background of his father, he had not been circumcised. So his mother had had to adjust to that. But on the other hand, his mother had been able to teach him the Old Testament scriptures. And he went on then to learn the gospel and so forth. So it would appear that Timothy's father made some sort of adjustment there, that either Timothy's mother was teaching him secretly, or else Timothy's father was willing to go along with Timothy being taught the Old Testament scriptures, being taught about God and so forth. So what you see in this relationship is both adjusting. In the case of Moses and Zipporah, it was Zipporah, the wife, who adjusted to her husband's background. In the case of Solomon and his wives and concubines, Solomon adjusted to their background. And here, with Timothy's parents, it would appear that husband and wife may well have both made some adjustments in regard to one another's backgrounds. So, what applications can we draw from this? The first one is that we have to learn what is essential to us and what is not, what we can be flexible about and what we can't. When we read Genesis 17, we saw that for the Jews, for the Israelites, male circumcision was an essential matter in regard to their covenant relationship with God. And thus, Moses and Zipporah were confronted with that fact. This was not a discussion issue. This had to be done. And really, Timothy's mother, before they became Christians, would have had that matter on her own mind as well. Then we come to Solomon and his wives. Really, Solomon should not have adjusted to his wives in regard to their pagan gods. And that goes way back to Exodus, the 20th chapter, and the Ten Commandments, which were a summary of the Old Covenant. God made it very clear there that worshipping idols was not on. Exodus 20 and verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. Don't do it. 10 Commandments. And yet Moses compromised on that issue. So there are matters on which there should not be compromise. Matters involving our salvation, matters involving our commitment to God and to Jesus Christ. And this, to me, illustrates the value of dating. I'm not a great fan of online dating. To me, there is a great advantage in a couple spending time together, being able to talk about things, being able to see how one another reacts to different things, being able to see what are essential matters for each one, to be able to see whether there's going to be room for compromise on some things, or whether being married to the other person is going to mean giving up certain core values, if you like. And thus it is that by dating, you have an opportunity to know this. Are you a Christian? Is the person you are going to marry a non-Christian who stands fast and is strongly opposed to religion? Well, if you marry that person, you're going to have great difficulty. And over the years, I've seen many young people in the church marry outside the church and end up giving up their faith and falling away from God. We really need to think seriously about those matters which we shouldn't compromise, and think about those before we marry. Something else. Whilst there are certain issues where there is no room for flexibility, there are many practical matters where there is room for flexibility, and in fact, where there is a need for flexibility, where we need to adjust to one another. I have a list in some of my teaching notes, areas where there's a call for adjustment. Some of those areas are finances, social and recreational activities, in-law relationships, friendship patterns, matters relating to having and raising children, communication. You might have a wife who wants to talk things through and a husband who tends to bottle things up. Well, there's going to be a need for some adjustment there. Household chores, concepts of household tidiness. I don't know how many homes I visit in where the first statement is, excuse the mess. And I look around, I can't see a mess. But you may have one of the couple who can spot a fleck of dust at 20 paces, whereas the other is not so concerned. Okay, they're tidy in their own way, but they're not bothered about some things. Well, in that case, there's going to be a need for some adjustment. Food. Lavinia likes meat. I am not a great meat eater. Career choices, work patterns, sex, time use, concepts of punctuality. Lavinia can tell you, I am a person who likes to be somewhere a lot earlier than the scheduled time. And if I'm not ready to go out of the door at what I think is the necessary time, I can start getting nervous and edgy. Lavinia's had to adjust to that, and I'm trying to work on it as well so that I'm a bit more relaxed about things. But if you read the biography of Dickie Bird, the English cricket umpire, read about his need to be early. It's quite funny. So there are a whole lot of areas where there is room for flexibility. And this is especially going to be important in the early stages of marriage, but it's going to be necessary throughout marriage as well, because as a couple, you are going to come to various situations and experiences which you haven't faced before, and thus your different approaches and backgrounds will come out there, and you might need to adjust in order to handle the situations. So for there to be flexibility, there obviously needs to be love, there needs to be patience, there needs to be understanding, there needs to be communication, there needs to be unselfishness. There's a good summary of these values over in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and I think it's verses 4 and 5. This is the chapter dealing with the matter of love. And notice the qualities here. 13 and verse 4. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. There's some positive characteristics that very much have a place in marriage. I mentioned earlier that when Lavinia and I got married back in 77, Lavinia had lived in the same house all her life, from when she was born till the day that she married me. At the same time, I had lived at least 15 different addresses in 2 different countries, as well as living on my own. Since our marriage, what's happened? Well, we've lived at 14 addresses in 4 different states of Australia, plus we spent 4 months overseas in the US and England, moving from place to place. So Lavinia faced a big change in regard to that. What about me? Well, through my later teenage years and then during the 4 years that I'd lived on my own, I'd become very much a loner. So marriage involved a big change for me, as I had to learn to be a husband with a wife, as I had to learn to be a father, and even now as I'm a grandfather. And Lavinia has had to put up with some difficult times at times with me making that adjustment. So there is this issue here of 2 people coming into a marriage from different backgrounds and learning to get on together, handling things together as a married couple and then as parents of growing children. Now, it is true that in regard to salvation, in regard to God, there are some things where there is no flexibility. We need to be committed. We need, therefore, for those who are not yet married, to be very thoughtful about who we choose to marry. But in a whole range of other areas, marriage does call for flexibility. There are selfish people who insist it's their way. It has to be their way, my way or the highway. That's their point of view. But for marriage to be successful, it must go from 2 individuals who have been thinking in terms of my way to a couple who have learned to think in terms of our way. They've made the adjustments. And that's not just for the first 6 months or first 3 years of marriage. That goes on right through the marriage. Let's pray together. Father, when you created us as social beings, and you created marriage as a part of that. And for many, marriage is difficult. We look at the divorce rate these days. And even for people who are married, there are times of conflict, difficult times where there is friction. But if we could learn to apply all the different aspects that are taught in your word, we could make marriage so much more effective. Help us to be people who can learn to love and to care, particularly for our wives, our husbands, and for our children. Help us to learn to be unselfish. Help us to learn to be understanding. Help us to learn to communicate with one another, to care for one another, to be willing to make adjustments where there is room to make adjustments. We do recognize, Lord, our need to be firmly committed to you, and help us to maintain that commitment. But in matters where we can be more understanding, more flexible, help us to care enough about others to be able to consider them and their needs and to act accordingly. To you, Father, be honour and glory through Christ. Amen. Well, as things stand, we've reached a point where there is talk about some relaxation of rules, but still there's a long road to go. It's good that we've all been able to get through another week, and I hope and pray that your coming week will go well, and look forward to seeing you again next weekend. Again, goodbye for now.